All right, welcome back to PacwestBigfoot.com. This is David, and before we get started on this week's encounter story, I wanted to say thank you very much to Amber, who was the winner of the free giveaway this month. Your poster was sent out to you the day before yesterday, so it should be there. So, yay. That's me clapping. If you'd like to win some awesome prizes and gifts and get some special offers and stuff from some of the advertisers here, I'll tell you what, here's the deal. You can get over to Pacwestbigfoot.com and get subscribed today. Okay? With that, let's get into this week's encounter story. Like I said, this one really kind of brings back memories, as this one actually comes from a friend of my grandfather's. It just brought back a lot of awesome memories. My grandfather was a lumberjack. We used to spend a lot of my weekends chopping wood and stuff with him. So, he was an awesome man. So with that, let's get going. This is going to be a little bit of a longer story today, so if I clear my throat from time to time or take a nice little sip of the old Sasquatch coffee here, please forgive me. I'm a human being. I have to clear my throat sometimes. So here we go. Multiple Bigfoot trash camper of logger in Happy Camp, California. I got my first job with a logging company that summer. And at the same time, I also got my first introduction to Bigfoot outside of the town of Happy Camp, California. And just so you know, it was not a happy experience, not even close. While the town itself today seems to be the home to a more hippyish way of life, and for those seeking to be friends with every animal and creature that roams the forest around there, I will tell you what, that is why some of those young people go missing in the woods today. They thought this creature was a friend. Actually, it's a predator. Yes, I believe it is a little reluctant to mess with people, but if you go playing with fire, well, after what you learn from this little encounter, you could get burned playing with it. The Graybacks of Happy Camp, California. There was a road, and I take it there still is in Happy Camp, called Grayback Road. I know the reason for the name. Back then, we all knew the reason for the name, especially after those giant devils tore apart my camper with me in it. Okay, they did not actually tear it apart completely, but they did try to smash it, and me, while I was in it. And let me tell you what happened, and why I think it happened. The summer job. I was barely old enough to have hair on my legs, let alone my armpits, when I got the job. It was my first summer job, and I was going to save the money for college. I would graduate from Crater High School in Central Point, Oregon in a year, and that would make things easier for my parents financially. Back then, you did things like that for your parents and yourself. You worked hard to pay your own way in life, even college. Well, at least as much as you could. My first job, when I turned 17, was a great paying one down in Happy Camp, California, as a security detail at a logging camp. Of course, this is right before the Patterson-Gimlin film of Bigfoot down around that part of northern California that came out. Up to that point, there were sightings and footprints galore being found all over the place, but no real proof other than that. As a matter of fact, I was told by the foreman and owner of the logging company that they did exist, just so you know. Both men told me of their own sightings, and the owner of the company had a cast of footprints in his office at the time that measured about 16.5 inches long. As far as I was concerned, and I may not be the smartest person ever, especially back then, but I was not going to fall for some old wives' tales about giants in the forest back then. I had enough of that growing up in Oregon, for crying out loud. That was a classic back then, as it is now, for some people trying to scare their friends or brothers or sisters when out in the woods. However, today, and after that summer, well, the stories would be all too real for me. Today, when I'm out hunting, fishing, camping with the family, I keep an extra pair of eyes in the back of my head, and I bring a gun. And I warn my grandchildren of this monster, and that it is in fact real. But back to the summer job. So my dad allowed me to take the little teardrop trailer we had for camping and whatnot. He would drive me down to Happy Camp, drop me and the trailer off at the site, and come back the first week of September to pick me up. Actually, it was my dad's friend from the mill in White City, Oregon, who got me the job. It was a family member of his down in California that was the foreman of the site at the time. Suffice it to say, I was a pretty big kid. I played football and lifted weights, and contrary to the dumb jock thing, I carried a 3.8 grade average. Grade point average. That was not bad at all. I was not dumb. I actually became a long-time and highly successful local business owner in the Rogue Valley for nearly 4 decades before my son took it over. But I needed the extra cash to help out with that first year of college, and being in the woods was just a bonus. My family and I loved the outdoors. For the foreman, well, he was getting an armed linebacker to guard and hold the fort down on the weekends and weeknights. Here and there, however, I would help out with daily lumberjack duties and whatnot. Back then, most workers would stay at local inns or motels and even stayed with local families, renting space from them for a few months at a time. Of course, nobody wanted to stay on site every night. It was their workplace, and nobody wanted to live where they work, I suppose. Each day around 5, 6 p.m., they would head back in and take off back to their home away from home, leaving me alone on top of that mountain. Slap happy and happy camp. Within the first week, I had become very familiar with the layout of the land. We were working just up out of town about 10 miles along a massive ravine that spilled out into a small valley and river below. Of course, groceries I could buy in town, but I brought with me my dad's spare .30-30 Winchester for both the job and for hunting, not to mention a fishing pole. Also, within that first week, I had just seen just about every animal track ambling through the campsite. They seemed to come down from the top of the ravine and into the valley below, then back again just before dawn. The third morning I woke to see my first live black bear and 3 cubs with her. That was pretty spectacular, to be honest. It was not until the second week that I found tracks which threw me off a bit. But before I tell you about it, I will tell you that I was warned about it, and I mean a literal it. When I got hired, well, the day my bosses officially hired me, they had said they were having issues here and there with what was described as an enormous ape-like animal. Of course, I thought this was all just for fun with the new guy, but they described it as tall, hairy, brownish in color, walked on 2 legs, mostly nocturnal, but has been spotted during the day occasionally, reddish eyes, and it left a few giant tracks around the outside of camp here and there. That was it, no real scary stuff, just enough to hopefully make me wide-eyed at night around here, I guess. What they did not know was that I was not scared of the dark, or anything in it for that matter. At least not yet. It was week 2 that put me on notice that I think the bosses were really having fun with me when I heard what sounded like a slap or something whacking the side of one of the machines outside. I decided when I heard that to take my last evening walk through the camp before turning in myself. The weekend was starting, and I was wondering as I walked if the taunting would last the whole time I would work here. Eventually, after seeing nothing and hearing nothing more, I headed off to bed. Before I fell asleep, though, I remember hearing a couple guys on a lunch break the other day talk about how they'd seen the thing while out hunting nearby a couple months back. And one other person, Jay, who would become good friends with eventually, who said he noticed something as well while falling some timber up the mountainside where we were currently. His sighting was about 3 weeks before I got there. As far as the description goes, Jay gave me almost the same list as my bosses did, however the discrepancy of color. Jay said it was black, solid black. The others mentioned a more reddish-brown color. That gave me reason to question the truth behind the claims. Red eyes in the dark. The next day I went out to take a walk around and to fuel up some of the machines and start them up and keep them from getting too cold. That was part of the job. As I was walking around the edge of the giant open area I was parked in myself, I noticed the footprints my bosses told me about. Just off the edge of the turnaround we were using to park and keep all our equipment and vehicles on the weekends in, I could also see a trail of impressions through grass-covered edges just off the gravel. I followed them as they seemed to do a straight line about 35 yards, at which point they made a beeline for a large vehicle, the one that I heard get slapped the night before. From there, the footprints went straight back to the edge of the turnaround and back off down the hill into the forest, where we were not foresting anything at the time. Bigfoot, that is what they were calling it. They mentioned it was probably there because it always had been, or at least maybe this area its home and is now wondering what to do now that we were in it. Of course, the name was not only obvious of why they would call it Bigfoot, but at the moment I figured they were fake tracks somehow, although I did admit to myself for a moment or so that they were real good fakes, very realistic to be sure. Where there was thicker mud, you could actually make out some toes, and I noticed the size immediately. I did not measure them, as I figured they were likely fake, but looking back later on, they had to be all of 17 to 18 inches at least. What did catch me by surprise and change my mind happened a few weeks later, and it really, put all my senses on alert. To tell you the truth, that is kind of an understatement. I remember that night perfectly, and the next one that was even scarier. I had eaten dinner in the trailer and afterwards cleaned up a bit, grabbed myself a book, and turned on the radio to listen in on a baseball game. It was 30 minutes or so when slap on the vehicle outside happened again. This time, however, I had the flashlight beside me and shoes on, and I was ready to jump out the door and catch them in the act. The door was practically slammed behind me as I stormed through it. No, I was not armed. I did not want an accident to happen. Once I came to a stop, I could hear heavy steps to the left towards the vehicles, yet heading away from them. They were very heavy steps, easy to follow in the dark. I flashed my light just in time to see the most brilliant red eyes I'd ever seen in my life. I could not make out the face so much, except for the fact that whoever it was must be using stilts, because those eyes were near a young tree that was more than 14 feet tall, and this person was at least 90 feet of that. All of a sudden, I felt as though I should have brought the gun. A growl that I could practically feel all of a sudden came from this what I thought was a person at first. And at that moment when it growled, I started to realize might not actually be a person. In a flash, the growl stopped. I heard a grunt, for the lack of a better description, and whatever it was disappeared in the woods, back down the hill and into the forest. Then, moments later, as I still stood there trying to figure things out, I heard a large snap, and a tree being broken, I suppose, and then nothing. Everything went quiet except for the chirping of the crickets that was quickly coming back to the early summer night. A crushing experience with Bigfoot. I had a two-way radio, CB basically, up there, and some Sunday morning when I was chatting with the boss who lived in the town of Happy Camp, I told him about the incidents. All I could get from him was an "I told you so." He told me to keep my distance with this thing and to always keep my gun around, as this thing seems to know what they are, he believed. I was still not completely sold on the idea of Bigfoot. I was still, a bit skeptical. Bigfoot was not real to me yet. It was a myth from old, a topic that brought up around the campfire to scare each other while out in the forest, as I stated before. It, being a real animal or creature of sorts, was still foreign to me. However, I was constantly trying to figure out what else those eyes could be attached to the rest of the day. Evening came, and this time I was a little on edge. I was still wondering what in the world that thing was. It sounded like it moved rather quickly through the dark, at least a whole lot faster than I could, and I'm a healthy linebacker. I decided not to get all worked up about it, and I remember, so I turned on a ball game on the radio again and picked up my book where I left off. It was pitch black outside by almost 9 p.m. It was getting darker later already. Tonight would be much darker as some clouds had moved in. No rain yet, but you could tell it was coming. The last thing I remember before all heck broke loose was hearing of whistling outside. I did get the nerve up to go outside to hear better what it was and where it was coming from. Well, I was a little nervous at that point. I was still thinking it was all a joke on the new guy. I heard one whistle come from the west, down the mountainside. About 45 seconds later, another one, but this one from the east side of the camp, up the mountain. The only thing I believe could whistle out there at the time were either people or birds. I was falling on the side of people I knew. I sat my gun down against a loader and walked over to the edge of the open turnaround to let out a few whistles myself. I got one back from the east behind me. Next, one came from the west. I whistled again, and that is when it all started. They were not people. They were a pair of Bigfoot, and I was about to learn that they were not happy with me whistling at them at all. I heard crashing as if something was making its way through brush and trees as it headed up the mountainside at a very fast pace towards me. I ran to the trailer. Once inside, I heard a scream from the east. It could not have been more than 30 to 60 feet on the other side of the trailer, too. It was a high-pitched scream that seemed to last at least 10 seconds or so, and it practically vibrated through me and the trailer. Right before it ended, I was jolted sideways as a slap, or more like a whack and a push than anything on the teardrop happened. I fell sideways a bit, caught myself against the side of the trailer. It was that hard. Next thing you know, it was like being in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, because everything was rocking back and forth, including me. Growling grunts, a scream, a weird loud gibberish is what I could hear as they continued to beat on and push back and forth the trailer. Fortunately, back then, things were made rather sturdy, but still, I was afraid that this thing was going to come apart at the seams. And whatever they were going to tear me apart as well. Both sides of the trailer started giving way. Not cracking or anything, but the metal was being pushed in from both sides. Once that stopped, they started beating on the top of it, and at that point, the roof started caving in. It was as if their forearms and fists were just pounding away on the top of the trailer. I was going to be smashed to death, I thought. It took me a second, but I finally thought to myself, "Gun, get the gun." That is when all hope was lost, and I sank onto the bed thinking I was going to die. I left the gun outside. They continued wailing on the trailer, and eventually one of them pushed so hard it literally rolled over on its side. I was tossed so hard I literally got a nasty cut above my eye when I hit the corner of a drawer. Well, I think it was a drawer. Unfortunately, though, the small window shattered. Now there was a way for these things to try and get in if they could, not smash their way in first. But at that moment it stopped. However, they lingered outside, pacing around. I could hear the heavy footsteps every few minutes or so as they kept circling. Were they trying to get in, or were they simply just trying to scare me off? I mean, seriously, if they wanted in, I believe they could have at any time. While this trailer was made of metal, it was a thin metal, and now there was a broken window they could reach in, grab hold of, and probably tear off that side of the whole trailer. After about 3-4 minutes, I could not hear them walking or pacing around, but I could hear the gibberish between them being said. They seemed to have been further away from the trailer at that point, probably around the edge of the turnaround or road. I decided to take a look out the broken window. Stupid maybe, but I had to. I just felt I should. As I looked out across the road, when the clouds would pass by and give way to the light from the moon, I could make out 2 tall figures directly across the turnaround from me, maybe 25 to 30 feet at the most away. Both had reddish eyes that seemed to glare right through me. I don't know if they could see me, but I felt they could. I could not make out too much of the face other than the color of the eyes that would disappear and reappear as the clouds did their thing above. When the moonlight did shine, however, I tried to take in all I could, just in case I lived through it. I'd be able to describe these, things, animals, or whatever they were. They were tall. I think one must have been around 9-foot mark, while the others seemed a few inches shorter, but it was dark, and they both had a slight hunch to them, so I could not be sure of either, other than the stature. The eyes were huge and red, to tell you the truth. I could not make out exact hair color, although the larger one had a patch of gray on its back. Both, however, were mostly dark overall, as far as I could tell. They sat there for hours. Not kidding, they sat there until the sun came up and the gibberish talk ended. Morning has broken. They were gone, and by the end of the day, so was I. There was no reason for me to stick around at my young age and risk being killed or maimed for life by some Bigfoot in the wild. That was not going to happen to me. Of course, my bosses understood. Looking at the trailer Monday morning, they actually offered me the whole summer's pay as a gift for college. And anyways, I think they figured they owed it to me or something. But it was a nice gesture that I appreciated for sure. The other workers that day were told to head home for a few days, probably because the bosses wanted to give these Bigfoot time to cool off, or maybe move on, hopefully. I moved on, though. I got to town, called my dad, rented a room from a local inn for the night, and that was the last time I ever went to Happy Camp, California, again.